So first, before we get started, I do want to encourage you, if you have your mobile devices and you tweet, please feel free to tweet using the hashtag UUJPDLead. So we're going to start with a story about the single most important thing that happens in any Unitarian Universalist congregation: coffee hour. A congregation committed to coffee hour had a couple of people who every week worked this old bun coffee machine. They got there an hour and a half before the service started to make sure that they could get it to work and heat up so that there was enough coffee. And the bun started taking longer and longer to work. And when people who knew how to run it weren't there, well, let's just say we had more than one flood. So some of our older folk said, we need a committee. We need to figure out what to do, what to buy, how to handle this. We need to get people trained and do all this stuff. And we had some people in their late 50s, early 60s who said, we don't need that. We just buy a bunch of cheap Mr. Coffee machines and we'll run those. So we had this battle for a little while of a line of $10 Mr. Coffees and the clunky old bun. And coffee hour from week to week was truly a hit or miss proposition. And finally, one of the guys, about 35 or so, looked at it all and said, why don't we buy the coffee already made? Well, they wanted to form a committee. Find the best price, how would they deliver it, could we get fair trade? Meanwhile, one of our high school kids on her iPhone pulls up and says, hey, Uncommon Grounds has free trade coffee with carafes for $3 a piece. And we solved the problem of coffee. Now, I tell you that story because what struck me as this was going on, the great coffee controversy of 2005, was why was the reaction so different from generation to generation? Which led me to learn a little bit about generational theory. Now, I have a background as a writer, editor, director, actor, singer, publisher. My home congregation is in upstate New York, where the Travers is run, where I've served on the board of the congregation as worship chair and stewardship chair. I've also done a lot of work with the St. Lawrence district, and I'm currently a second-year seminarian at Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York. They would ask me to tell you. But while I was doing this work, my interest kept peaking. I kept going, wow, this generational stuff is interesting. And I met a fellow named Carl Eman, who wrote a book called Generations of Faith, which is out at the front, where Carl took theories from Neil Strauss and William Howell that looked at how our cohorts seem to repeat in terms of our characteristics, and they repeat through history. What they saw is what I saw, that we're all facing sort of the same truth, that our group, our cohort, understands things and no one else does. You know, every generation says, what is wrong with these kids today? Every generation says, the older people don't get me, and they never did. And this happens generation after generation. So they began to look at history, and they began to look at cohorts. And what they said was, it's more than just young and old. It's about cultural influences. It's about political influences. It's about parenting styles and what a cohort goes through. And all of these things, history, parenting, culture, are all on a pendulum swing of about 90 years or so. And so they did quite a bit of work to see how those patterns emerged. Now, I like Strauss-and-Howe's theory. I think it takes into account some things that other generational theories don't take into account. There are many models, but this is the one that worked for me, and it's the one that worked for Carl Eman, his book, Generations of Faith. It also worked for some of our UU ministers in this book called Reverend X, which is essays from Generation X ministers on the future of Unitarian Universalism. So these are two of my main sources for today. Now, the other question is, why generational theory? At a leadership conference, when there are so many theories about leadership. Well, it's true. There are many theories about leadership, and all of them have worth, and all of them have some shortcomings. But just as we are a plural faith that takes in many ideas, as leaders, we should have many different tools in our toolbox. So I'm offering this to you kind of deeply to really think about as a tool in your toolbox. So there are three main areas, or elements, to the Strauss-and-Howe theory of generational theory. The first is type. And hopefully, those of you who also came prepared, having read some of the material. So you got a sense of generational biographies. And I want to highlight just a little bit here. The four generational types are all in the room. I will say that first. And these are the four particular cohorts that are in the room. So the first is the silent generation. If you are 70 to 87, would you raise your hand? Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4. Awesome. Okay. So they were born 1925 to 1942. There were about 47 million born in this generation in the United States. Their formative era, the Great Depression and World War II. Events like Pearl Harbor, the Korean War, the House Un-American Activities Committee, Brown versus Board of Education, the birth of rock and roll. And they are in their elderhood. The next generation down are the boomers. Raise your hand if you were born 1943 to 1960. There are 78 million of you born, which is why it was called a boom, right? Your formative era was the Cold War. Formative events include the Cuban Missile Crisis, the assassinations, Vietnam, the building of the Berlin Wall. And you are in adulthood working into your elderhood, because the oldest of you are 69. And then there's the generation they could never find a name for. Generation X. Excellent. Excellent. We are a much smaller generation. 44 million of us were born. Does anybody have an idea why that may be true? Birth control. Exactly. Exactly. Our formative era, I hate to say, was Reagan's Morning in America. Our events were Watergate, the Berlin Wall coming down, the Challenger explosion, Desert Storm. Our youngest are in rising adulthood, and the rest of us are in adulthood. And then our millennials. Raise your hands. Yes. Some of our millennials are still kids. They're 8 years old. The oldest are 29, and there are 88 million millennials. So you talk about a pendulum swing. There are lots of them. Their formative eras, the culture wars, and this whole new homeland security environment that we're in. There are events, September 11th, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and Occupy Wall Street. And of course, they're in youth and rising adulthood. Each of these generations has a biography and characteristics which are formed in part by the events that were happening, the size, how they were parented. And I'm not going to go into a lot of that. If you want it, check out our resources.